Here's just about everything that you need to know about cluster munitions in Ukraine. Recent breaking news stories have begun to discuss an impending, if not already announced based on when this video is released, security assistance package from the United States that will include cluster munitions. Now, we've discussed cluster munitions before on the live show, right here on Mondays and Fridays at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. There are still a few critical details about cluster munitions that go either purposefully ignored or just aren't being discussed enough. That's what this video is for. Defining cluster munitions first and foremost is relatively simple. Any munition that employs explosive bomblets that are specifically designed to be dispersed or released from dispensers. That's effectively a cluster munition. Other systems like the HIMARS, M31A1, 180,000 tungsten steel balls, BB-sized hell rain, that's not a cluster munition. Now, in those critical details, the first thing we have to talk about is their lawful use. The treaty regulating and banning the use of cluster munitions is the Convention on Cluster Munitions. It was adopted in Dublin on May 30th, 2008. Now, it entered into force on August 1st, 2010. There are 108 signatory states and 111 states party to the treaty. The difference between the two being that signatory states aren't technically legally bound by the treaty. They just make an agreement to act in, quote, good faith to not defeat the object and purpose of the treaty. More simply, they handshake to follow the rules. States party to a treaty, however, they have agreed to be legally bound by its requirements. The specific requirements of the Convention on Cluster Munitions under Article 1 of the treaty are that each state party undertakes never, under any circumstances, to use cluster munitions. They're also bound to not develop, produce, acquire, stockpile, retain, or transfer cluster munitions. What's the applicability of this treaty on Ukraine, though? Well, that's the thing. It doesn't apply regardless of air or ground-based. Both Ukraine and Russia are not either signatory nor party to the treaty. For a full round out of the countries applicable, neither is the United States. China also. China's also not a party or a signatory of it. For what that's worth. Now, Russia's been using cluster munitions for quite some time in Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't have a similar capability of wide area terrain denial like this, though. The majority of munitions provided by the West have been a more point target type capability, and that includes systems such as the HIMARS and Excalibur for the 155 howitzers. The Department of Defense recently admitted to U.S. lawmakers that it felt cluster munitions, and more specifically DPICM, more on that in just a few minutes, would be very effective at dislodging dug-in Russians in trenches.
General, I spoke in my opening statement about the administration not giving Ukraine the weapons it needs to win. Chief among them are the cluster munitions.
Yes, Chairman Rogers. So the munition in question here is dual purpose, improved conventional munitions. We call it dual purpose because it releases bomblets, some of which are anti-personnel fragmentation grenades and some of which are shape charges that attack vehicles from above. It's very effective munition. It's very effective against mixed targets of personnel and equipment. Especially when those targets are gathered into dense formations.
So what exactly would Ukraine be getting? Now, at the time of this video being written and filmed, it's somewhat unclear, but it's likely that Ukraine's going to receive some form of the artillery-delivered dual-purpose improvised conventional munition, or DPICM, especially given the DoD's statements. I find it somewhat unlikely that the U.S. is going to provide air-based cluster bombs, which have similar functionality, but obviously are delivered via air. DPICM is an artillery warhead designed to burst into submunitions and has a high-density capability of denying the use of terrain by either armor in certain circumstances or personnel, hence the dual purpose.
The high explosive round can do a couple of things. It can either detonate upon impact, or we can have it detonate in the air where it explodes from within, spraying shrapnel in a given location. But the devastation and the destruction of dual-purpose improved conventional munition is almost beyond belief without actually experiencing it falling on you. The devastation that occurs on equipment and other things when those shape charges goes off is almost intolerable to try to survive under a barrage of DPICM. That is the munition of choice on the battlefield.
The more modern submunition projectile, the M80, has both of those properties built into it: fragmentation, as well as a shape charge for defeating some types of armor. The M80 also has a capability that historically wasn't present with many submunitions: self-destruction. If after somewhere between 3 to 7 minutes of deployment it hadn't yet exploded, the M80 will self-destruct. Now, the M80 is delivered via 105mm M915 or M916 projectiles, with the difference between the two largely being the range. The US alone has provided 72 105mm howitzers to Ukraine, according to the DoD's fact sheet. Dependent upon which projectile, if it is DPICM that's provided, Ukraine could be receiving the much older M42 or M46 submunition, both of which do not have the self-destruction capability built into them. The M41A1 and M864 155mm projectiles fire either the M42 or M46, with the latter, the M864 projectile, having a range of up to 30 kilometers. The US has provided quite a few more 155mm caliber systems than 105 by at least a multiple of 2. A possible alternative, or even additional cluster munition that could be destined to Ukraine, is ATACMS, more specifically ATACMS Block 1 or Block 1A, which is fired by both the HIMARS and the M270.
The new Army TACMS has greater range and a greater payload. Future versions of MLRS and TACMS will carry guided submunitions able to hunt out tanks with pinpoint accuracy.
ATACMS Block 1 and Block 1A deliver either 950 or 300 M74 anti-personnel and anti-materiel, or APAM, bomblets, respectively. These little bastards are tungsten balls of death, raining down hellfire with a range of between 12 and 186 miles, or 20 to 300 kilometers. Each individual ball has an anti-personnel radius of 15 meters. The primary difference between the Block 1 and the Block 1A outside of payload and range would be the guidance. Block 1A has GPS-aided guidance, and Block 1 is really just inertial or ballistically guided. The US has a lot more Block 1 and Block 1A missiles than they do the more modern M57 and M57E1. Those ATACM missiles, which would be necessary for the more colloquial use of ATACMS, targeting the Kerch Bridge to disrupt supply to Crimea. Those bad boys have 500-pound warheads on them. Ukraine's ability to dislodge entrenched infantry is ultimately the capability increase that these munitions are going to provide, or at least that they should provide. Those against the provision cite the historical precedent and propensity for the systems to fail after they release, which exacerbates the challenges post-war of demining and clearing unexploded ordnance. Ukraine is primarily an agrarian economy as well, and those mined and potentially submunition-laden countryside fields that they need to farm are going to be a challenge for humanitarian teams clearing those areas for decades to come, long after the cities are rebuilt. We'd like to thank the sponsor of tonight's episode, Zydex. If you're looking for a custom-built PC to game on, to power your home office, or even just to have something reliable, Zydex has you covered. Zydex has a lifetime warranty on parts and labor. So if your GPU or another component fails after the 1-year manufacturer warranty, Zydex is going to cover that replacement for you. All of their systems are built in Salt Lake City and have US-based tech support. We'd like to thank Zydex very much for sponsoring the video. Make sure you guys check the pinned comment down below or the stream description if you'd like links. I'll also put a card up right here. Thanks again, guys. That's going to be it for this episode. Hit the like, sub, bell, and stay informed.